pendu. Sitôt qu'on le touche, il résonne. De Bérengère. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit.
What then about the referential use of setting? The referential, a bridge between story plot and the world to which it refers, and is, quote unquote, about. Well, with regard to setting, Kennedy and the rest are minimalist. Setting is, quote, the time and place of a literary work. That doesn't tell us that much. The Norton is more helpful, I think. It is more expansive. The Norton editors describe setting as the element of the story that, quote, generates the conflicts, defines the characters, and gives the story purpose and meaning. So much so that there would be little, if any, story left if all the details somehow transported to a different time, place, and social milieu. That quote is from the Norton, actually, not from Abrams and Harpham. Setting is functional. Time, place, and social milieu matter. And setting situates the story in a time, a place, and a social milieu. Perhaps, okay, what's the ambition? What is the aim in so doing? Perhaps in order to say things about that time, about that place, about the social milieu. In this case, the husband, he's a physician. So one target of the story, right? The story is telling us something about the time and the place, the people to be found in the place, perhaps, the social milieu. Well, the institution of medicine as practiced at this time, perhaps. As a few of you noted in passing, Gilman's setting is, quote, a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate in which wealthy upper-class people live. Not a place or social milieu usually associated with physicians, who at that time, they were economically well off enough, as they certainly are these days, but they were not socially elite, so much so at that time. And certainly they were not the owners of hereditary estates, who tended to be very wealthy and socially positioned in a way that they were not part of the professions even, like lawyers and doctors as much. They were independently wealthy and did not have to work. So you see how setting points to, quote, purpose and meaning, when purpose of the story could be to characterize the lives of rich folks. He's a doctor after all. Rich folks living on an estate that's been secured, right? Which is an interesting word that shows up at a certain moment, during a very specific post-colonial, after the colonial era, the late 1800s, as several of you note. The story is not just about the medical profession, it's also about people who are fairly well off. And perhaps newly so. Read on. Note how Sarli and Nanette also quoted the line, or quote, the line quoted above. The house is a colonial mansion, a hereditary state. I'm quoting Nanette's quote in this moment. I would say a haunted house, something queer about it. The narrator is also haunted, queer, and much like that colonial mansion. Many rooms to be explored. The house is a symbol on this reading, on Nanette's reading. And we'll talk about this in two plates. But for now, the referential. What does the referential emphasize in this moment? In this quote, the non-symbolic real-world qualities of the house, what it represents economically, socially, politically, culturally, and so forth. Elijah notes what the narrator sees outside one of her windows. Quote, I get a lovely view of the bay and a little private wharf belonging to the estate. There's a beautiful shaded lane that runs down there from the house. I always fancy I see people walking in these numerous paths and arbors. This house once belonged, clearly, to the wealthy leisure class, and the doctor, husband of the narrator, who has brought her there for the summer, she describes as, quote, a physician of high standing. This is something noted by Sarli. Thus is introduced, I believe, the issue of social class. Denise, a student in a different section, spies another layer. Quote, the narrator states that it's not that often that ordinary people like her and her husband acquire homes like this. Obviously, there was some tradition in having a colonial mansion, but at the same time, the description of it makes it seem like the home itself presents a bad omen. Well, Gilman's setting helps to indicate, if nothing else, the doctor's social aspiration. He is an ordinary person who has delightedly bought up a mansion for the summer, rather secured it, an ancestral mansion, one that makes the narrator, quote, think of English places that you read about. John, we may infer, is a member of the nouveau riche, the newly rich. He's a social climber, and his self-confessed ordinary wife is, well, along for the ride. Okay, the atmospheric then. Pretty close to symbolic, a step in the direction of the symbolic, but not identical. The atmospheric use of setting establishing mood. It creates a kind of emotional weather through which the characters will be making their ways. Characters acknowledge it now and then, try to ignore it or defy it, implicitly if not explicitly, even come to discover it as a truth that has thus far eluded them. A very famous example of such mood setting. It was a dark and stormy night. But here's a better one. And I wonder whether you can identify where this is from. Just go back to plate 1. Maybe you have a little bit of a sense. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening grew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable, because poetic, sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. And I'll pause there. Actually, I will stop there and just call your attention to a couple of details of what I've just read. You'll notice that he doesn't pause and talk about the vacant eye-like windows. Now, don't those look like symbols? The house looking at him, those look like symbols to me. They look like a window that is eye-like. Okay, it's as though the house, and maybe the entire tradition that the house represents, is looking upon him. The family, whose manor house this is, and whose history is embodied in the house, as we find out is especially the case with the Ushers, okay, would lend to those windows that are eye-like but vacant at the same time, this suggestion of some truth about the family that we could talk about, okay, if we had time. But the main thing to see is that that's a little bit different from creating an atmosphere, right, which I think is sustained. The atmosphere that's already been created is sustained by, for example, the few rank sedges, the few white trunks of decayed trees. Those don't really symbolize anything. They indicate, corruption, decay, rankness, kind of neglect, and they tell us something about like a weather that is more or less permanent to this space. It's just kind of dreary, right? Heavily dreary, hung oppressively low in the heavens, that dull, dark, and soundless day, which it always seems to be, just as it always seems to be autumn at the House of Usher. So that's more the atmospheric. You can't really say that the decayed trees and the white trunks, that the whiteness of the trunks really signifies anything specific, symbolizes anything that you could really point to other than just a sense of things being wan and colorless and lacking in vitality, if you see what I'm saying. Now, you guys got into this a little bit, right? This atmospheric use of setting, as you discussed Gilman. Now, as Nanette asserts, quote, the room is yellow wallpaper that is ripped, a bed nailed to the floor, bars on the windows, and chains on the walls. This room is not a happy place, just like the narrator's mind. Notice how Nanette, in this moment at least, doesn't get into the nailing of the bed on the floor, which you can imagine symbolizing something. The bars on the windows and chains on the walls also, do they not symbolize a, something beyond atmosphere, something more specific? As many of you noticed, and we'll talk about this down the road here in a few minutes, the prison-like quality of the room, right? But what Nanette was interested in this moment, and some of the others of you have also been interested in, is this atmospheric quality that is produced by some of these details before we pause and look at how they may operate on us symbolically. Okay? What Nanette asserts could be put in other words, as another student puts it, quote, the setting sets the tone for us readers. And this is something, again, this tone is something that some of you explored. KCB, the narrator, quote, hates the room, specifically the yellow wallpaper, which she describes as repellent, almost revolting. Notice how Casey is not interested in this moment in the yellowness of the wallpaper as a kind of traditional symbol of something, right? But more the feeling you get when you look at nasty wallpaper, maybe especially yellow wallpaper, but you're not really interested in the yellowness. You're just paying attention to the atmosphere created by it, which is one of, repulsion, revulsion, right? It is a sickly, sickening, unhappy tone. I think we could all agree that is set by the wallpaper. Mark goes on, she exists, the narrator exists in this grotesquely colored purgatory at the whim of her husband. I thought that was nicely put. That's a wonderful phrase. And as the story plays out, Sarli adds, the room itself develops a darker mood, right? Notice this idea of a mood attaching to a space, and you have a good sense of the atmospheric use of setting, which tends to attach certain moods to certain spaces, okay? Yet, even early on, developing Sarli's thought, or qualifying it, as Jimmy notes, right, things develop, right, the mood darkens, right, but even early on, as Jimmy notes, the narrator knew that the paper was a bad omen. As she said, this paper looks to me as if it knew what a vicious influence it had. Okay, the atmospheric use of setting is all about, right, establishing these influences that certain spaces have on certain characters. Well, this one's pretty clear, is it not? If you understand anything about symbolism, right? And I know you read about that for this week. Authors manipulate elements of setting, not just in order to create social and historical reference points and relevancies, that's a referential use, and not just in order to establish an emotional mood or tone, which they might wish to do for any number of characterological reasons, for reasons of establishing a particular character's attitude, feeling, mood, spirit, though also for other reasons, sometimes also, or even referential ones, right, that you can do that atmospheric business that we talked about in the last plate, but also a third possible use and a third possible motive of those who create settings. It's not just the referential and the atmospheric, but also in order to create suggestive correspondences by means of which, symbols, by means of which to advance the plot and clarify or at least indicate the theme. Now, all of that is a lot of abstract language. Let's get into some examples in Gilman. What about atmospherics in Gilman? We've already been through those, haven't we? As we have already intuited, perhaps, the narrator's, quote, disgust and loathing of her situation, or established her dullness. Okay, as and something worse than dullness, right, as we were talking about in the last plate. The disgust and loathing of her situation, or disgust with loathing of her situation, are established early on, even as the wallpaper is hung up, as it were, before the reader. It's repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow. So what's the difference then, right? Well, the difference is that between a symbolic, that we want to use that term, we want to say that's a symbolic use of setting, as opposed to just merely an atmospheric use. I would argue that in those moments when we say, oh, look, that's symbolic, that's, overtly and directly symbolic, as opposed to this more indirect atmospheric, just think about it. It's in the atmosphere, the meaning is just up there kind of, or around there or whatnot. Symbolic is where, well, you'll see here in a moment, it's something that's more specific and something where there's a lot of attention paid to it. Let me read to you what I've written on it here. Setting becomes symbolic when its elements, these atmospheric elements, escape the atmospheric background to become the focus in their own right. I'm going to pause for a moment. Do you get that? But you can almost imagine that one of those clouds that are hanging very low in the sky, establishing a mood for the traveler in The Fall of the House of Usher from the last play. If you can imagine one of the clouds, he suddenly started paying very close attention to it, and it became an item picked out of the atmospheric background and on which he focused, and it seemed to carry a lot of meaning. And he was doing something with that cloud that told us something about him, affording it a meaning, embodying it, okay, or imbuing it with a significance that struck us as very, very odd and striking. Okay, then I think we'd be in the presence of this third sort of use of setting, this third motive of those who set. The wallpaper works atmospherically, as we saw in the last play. It works referentially. Is it a rich person's wall covering? It also works symbolically. Abrams' Harfum identifies symbol as a word or phrase that signifies an object or event, which in turn signifies something, or suggests a range of reference beyond itself. I want to get into just the idea, okay, well, like the thing, the idea of color, or the thing of color, okay, this basic pigment of irreducible pigment of color. Here, the very color seems to have a certain significance when we think of the word yellow, right? The word red has a certain significance that we, I bet we could brainstorm and figure out what we might want to say that significance was. We could certainly say that about white. We could say it about golden. For yellow, a feature or quality of an object, the wallpaper in this case, it's a traditional symbol, just as maybe you could say white is. White is a symbol of purity, right? Gold is a symbol of worth or value. Think, when we say, oh, I'm golden, or you're golden, we know what that means. Think of the story we would have. Here's a good way of testing just how effectual this color, you could just manipulating color, something that basic, can be as a symbolic use of setting. Imagine the title of the story being The Golden Wallpaper, okay, as opposed to the yellow wallpaper. I think you'd expect something very different, wouldn't you? And there's this novel by Henry James called The Golden Ball. Imagine calling it The Yellow Ball. And Doris Lessing wrote a book called The Golden Notebook, right? As opposed to the purple one, or working with the color purple. What about Alice Walker's The Color Yellow as opposed to the color purple? Something would be very, very different about these works. Think of yellow as opposed to golden or white, as I suggested a moment ago. One thing we know about yellow, it's not white or gold. It used to be white, okay? And it yellowed, right? Where we would see yellow as a symbol of, well, it suggests something spoiled or faded, stale at the very least, something unwholesome, smoldering, unclean, which is from the story. This is a more precise significance beyond its vague, atmospheric suggestion of disgust and loathing, if you see what I'm saying. Moreover, the yellow of the wallpaper is more than a means of establishing an emotional atmospheric backdrop. It is of interest in its own right. There is nothing retiring about it, rhetorically speaking. Moving into the foreground, it calls attention to itself. Indeed, she, the narrator, becomes fascinated by it, as if trying to understand it. We're talking about the color, right? Textures too, but the color. The narrator herself calls attention to the color and its significance, its variations in tone and what they might mean. It is a dull, several of you quoted this, it is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulfur tint in others. Bridget, for example, quote, the color of the wallpaper reminds me of gold, which could also symbolize a sort of gilded cage, right? She isn't truly being held against her will, but with enough isolation and delusions that the narrator goes mad and obsesses over the wallpaper. You'll see that to call a cage a golden cage, a gilded cage, is not to establish an atmosphere, but to, in fact, turn the room that is the gilded cage, the golden cage, into something, right? To suggest something about it that is beyond the thing itself. And that's what we call the symbolic use, very specific symbolic use of setting. Jasmine, quote, the room described as an asylum symbolizes a prison to the narrator. The yellow wallpaper itself almost symbolizes the narrator and her mental state as the story progresses. The narrator describes the yellow wallpaper as dull. And notice a student from a previous semester notes the deeply personal quality of the symbol. Well, noting yellow is usually a happy color. This is the narrator's personal symbol. It does not bring joy. It invites her deeper to madness. The notion of a personal symbol is interesting. Gilman exploits the traditional meanings associated with the color yellow, but gives them, or has her narrator give them, a personal twist. Personal inflection. Certainly the narrator herself would agree. As she exclaims, there are things in that paper, the wallpaper, the yellow wallpaper, which nobody knows but me, or ever will. And this is one of the mysteries of the story, what to make of the yellow wallpaper, what she makes of the yellow wallpaper when all is said and done. I think you could continue to have that conversation for a good long time before you felt that you'd really gotten to the bottom of it. The narrator herself insists on the personal meaning of that wallpaper, and in so doing, she shows setting, contributing to characterization. Symbolic number 2, then, exploring and coordinating several of your insights. Here we begin to see the suggestive complexity of Gilman's symbolism, which is not limited to the color yellow alone, but to the wallpaper so colored, taken as a whole, rich in detail, to the house too and its constituent elements. The house, the room, the furniture, and of course the wallpaper, symbols all. Yes, indeed, within the house, Emma writes, the woman is made to live in a room that was once a nursery. Nurseries themselves symbolize happiness and new beginnings as they're meant for babies, right? However, by making the woman stay here, you see what he's doing, right? It's as though John is trying to turn her into a baby, a creature entirely dependent on him. But the room has yet more disturbing features. Aaron notes how, quote, the windows are barred for little children, and there are rings and things in the walls, elements which symbolize the protagonist's physical and psychological confinement. These features evoke a prison-like atmosphere, reinforcing our sense of her lack of autonomy. Yes, even before we get to the symbolic wallpaper, we confront the symbolic enclosing and confining, limiting structure of the room. Another student notes how, quote, the bed is nailed down. There's a gate at the head of the stairs. Even the furniture carries ominous symbolic weight. The narrator misses her old childhood chair that always seemed like a strong friend. All this in a house that, as Sarli reminds us, is a haunted house. The house itself is symbolic. And of course, many explain this same symbolic resonance when discussing the wallpaper, in particular in its pattern. Jimmy notes, quote, her borderline obsession over the paper decor, one which culminates in her descent into madness. R, student from another section, speaks for many, quote, the wallpaper's chaotic pattern mirrors her mental disarray as she descends into madness. Disarray at times, but also, don't you think? I think some of you do. Insight, accuracy of intuition, at least potentially. Erin, quote, as she becomes obsessed with the wallpaper, not a good thing, it nevertheless comes to represent her struggle to find freedom and identity. So she seems to be putting it to good use. The wallpaper offers a chance, if only she can see it, if only she can read it right, to know the truth about her situation and potentially to escape it. Setting, quote, can occasionally be an actor in the plot, one which, quote, prompts characters' actions. You got that from the Norton. One can imagine the narrators projecting onto the wallpaper her inner hurt, and this being something of a horror story, the wallpaper somehow playing along. Then the question arises, playing on which side, right? Is it on her side, the wallpaper, or is it against her? Is it her enemy, the opposite of her old chair? Or is it something that functions much as the old chair did, as a strong, conceivably, or at least potentially, a strong friend? Erin quotes helpfully, the narrator for a time regards the paper as reinforcing her sense of her own powerlessness, right? This is the paper as a strong enemy, not a strong friend. Quote, this paper looks to me as if it knew what a vicious atmospheric, I can't help but add in passing, what a vicious influence it had. There was a recurrent, in here more symbolic use of setting indeed, there was a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. This is not such a friendly presence as one might hope and as one might think, given perhaps what happens by the end of the story, as we will soon see. Moreover, continue with the sense of the wallpaper is not necessarily all that friendly to her interests, as Olivia notes, quote, she also thinks she sees someone within the wallpaper, a woman like herself. And many of you notice this is such an important part of the story, right? When she looks at the wallpaper and notices that there's a woman in the wallpaper who has a situation kind of like her own. The question is, what does she make of her, and how healthy is this mirroring, as some of you are going to describe it, as we'll see down below. For some time, she sees in the confined woman just another victim, right? And this is not particularly reassuring. As Nanette quotes, quote, sometimes I think there are a great, this is the narrator herself saying this, sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, behind the wallpaper, within the wallpaper, right? And sometimes only one. And she crawls around fast and her crawling shakes all over. It's kind of scary, kind of depressing. It seems to me that could be potentially disabling of any kind of project of freedom getting by way of the wallpaper. The wallpaper could reinforce her sense that this is a place that's hard to escape from, and maybe you ought to just accept it, right? And there are even moments, this kind of goes with that strange image quoted by Aaron of the bulbous eyes and the broken neck, that spot. She at times even sees the woman in the scene as a, quote, taunting figure that keeps her locked away, as though in league with John and and the rest, all those who she imagines, especially John, of course, because he's behind it, her husband, the doctor, to keep her confined. As Jay quotes, student from another section, the woman in the wallpaper can seem vaguely threatening. The front pattern does move, and no wonder the woman behind shakes it. That's a quote from the story. Well, Mark wonders, it's no wonder that, in lacking any freedom, she sees someone like herself within the wallpaper. Well, the faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern. Not always is that shaking seen as threatening. The faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern as she wanted to get out. Now, that would be a mirroring of her own wish to escape. It's no wonder, Mark continues, that she eventually finds kinship in this person and attempts to free this person, okay? I pulled and she shook. I shook and she pulled. It's as though they're working together to attempt a mutual freedom, right? A mutual liberation. Olivia continues, quote, the scene of her ripping the wallpaper off, okay, which is beyond shaking it, reflects how she has been trapped in it, of course. Towards the end, she says, I've got out at last, in spite of you and Jane. The you is, of course, John the husband. And I pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back. Right? So I think we have a consensus among students in the class, and students in other classes as well, that ripping off the wallpaper in this moment represents the main character's bid for freedom. If she thinks she sees someone within the wallpaper mirroring her own entrapment, ripping it off might signify her own potential liberation. This is, of course, something that can occur when she gets past what we were talking about up above, which is a conceivably disabling sense of a shared dilemma that seems very difficult to escape simply because so many people are in it, right? Here's the rub, though. Here's the problem. Does this symbolic move, making the wallpaper represent a confining presence, and treating it accordingly, in other words, ripping it off, ripping it down, trying to escape, does that truly prove liberating? Could not such mirroring prove the reverse? If she sees, as S from another section puts it, quote, that she has been likely seeing herself all along, and sees that the truth about herself has been and is available in that revelatory mirror of the walls, it could be potentially liberating. But what? We have to ask ourselves if she does not, because I think at the end of the story, this is something that we have to ask ourselves when we see her condition at the very end of the story. What if she does not, right? You're still in the room. Okay, you've ripped down the wallpaper, but you haven't gotten anywhere. You're still in the room. You have to see the mirror as such, as a mirror. And then you begin to lose a little bit of interest in the paper, if you see what I'm saying. And it's no great achievement to have ripped the paper down and just be sitting there on the floor with the ripped paper in your hands. You really have accomplished nothing. You've destroyed a symbol, but you have not affected your own release from the situation. And that's why I would argue, and I think a lot would agree, that the ending is satisfying only if, as C puts it, quote, the further her mental state declines, the more she begins to believe that the woman trapped behind the pattern of the wallpaper is just she herself, okay? And that to free herself, she must do more than tear it down. N notes that the main character pulls down the wallpaper because the woman wants to come out of the wallpaper. Identifying with the woman trapped? Good, she's doing that, right? She sees part of herself in the wallpaper. This is something we've established beyond doubt. But failing to see that there really is no woman in the wall, that the woman trapped is simply a projection of her own fear, a projection of her own self. Failing, that is, to read the wallpaper is indeed but a mirror, simply a mirror. The woman is simply a mirror image. There is no woman there. There is just you. And you just saw your own situation. If you fail to see that, it's not so good, right? You then try, if you fail to see it as such, you then try to free her, madly tearing at the wallpaper, instead of freeing yourself, right? The better ending of the story would have her looking hard in the mirror, the wall, and then looking away and leaving the room. As P asserts, over the course of the story, she becomes, quote, consumed by the images she sees, or thinks she sees within the wallpaper. She becomes fixated on them. In the end, she needs to move past them. Their work as a mirror being done. The mirror itself being turned away from.
Indeed, wait until we get to Kafka. You don't have to wait long. Onward, inward. You're about to read another story about withdrawal, madness, confinement, art and the imagination or aesthetic impulse, as we will see. Not something we talk that much about. That you could argue that there's a touch of the artist about that narrator of Gilman's story. And we will certainly see that that is the case for Gregor Samsa, who is the hero of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and who suffers the presence of his family, much as the narrator of Gilman's story suffers the presence of hers. As you will see, and this is one of the first things I would like you to do as you begin reading for next week, is note just how close the scenario is to that conjured by Gilman. This time not a wife and a mother, but a son.